right. Thank you, Agnes. I'll hand the mic over to Samuel. Sam, welcome, and welcome to everyone who has joined just recently for session 2. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Charlotte, and good afternoon, good morning to all colleagues. Hope you had a break, and welcome to all of those who also joined now for this next session. First, again, to introduce myself, my name is Samuel Cheung. I'm the Chief of the Internal Displacement Section with UNHCR, and it is my deep pleasure to moderate what looks to be a very fascinating and rich panel of presentations we have upcoming here specifically on the subject of internal displacement. So very happy to open this session. We have a range of research, covering Afghanistan, Syria, Mozambique, and Indonesia. Distinguished presenters who will be presenting research relating to social cohesion, altruism and empathy, human capital, and women. So I'm going to be very short in this introduction and cede the floor and look forward very much to the presentations to come. Just by way of administratively, if I could remind all the speakers also, I'll be playing the role of timekeeper. So you have more or less 20-25 minutes for your presentations. I'll try not to interrupt you. If I need to kind of come on camera, I'll give you a little wave in terms of 5 minutes or 1 minute. And if I need to, then I'll come in and just tell you time's up. Just in that so that we can have a little bit of time for discussion from the participants who are on the call. For those of you who are on the call, please don't hesitate, if I may, to write your questions into the chat. Don't wait till the end. You can do that throughout the course of the presentation, and then, of course, then we can pull from those and have our speakers jump right into your questions once they conclude their presentations. So again, once again, please do encourage you to enter your questions in the chat as the presentations are going. You'll also feel free to raise your hand at the end if you would like to make a spoken intervention or question. And then our colleagues can unmute you and give you that opportunity. So without further ado, why don't we move on to our first presentation. And it is, the paper is entitled Prolonged Social Contact with Internally Displaced Migrants Does Not Reduce Prejudice Among Locals in Wartime Settings by Yang Zhou, as well as Jason Lyell. And I believe Yang Zhou, you will be presenting on their behalf. So without further ado, why don't I hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you so much to the organizers for this opportunity to present our work. This is co-authored with Jason Lyell, who's the James Wright Chair in Transnational Studies and Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth. I believe he's in attendance, so if people have questions in the chat, I think he can help answer some questions. So this work is based on experimental evidence from Afghanistan. This past summer, as many of you know, with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, we've seen a lot of important and extensive media coverage of Afghan refugees, people from Afghanistan who have fled their country. But at the same time, there was also a lot of internal displacement that has not received as much media attention. And so this is a press release from the International Rescue Committee, for example, in which David Miliband, the president of IRC, said, there's a double crisis facing Afghanistan right now, a visible crisis of thousands of people trying to leave the country from Kabul, and an invisible crisis of millions of people across the country dependent on humanitarian aid who cannot leave the country. And this is a graph of just the number of people experiencing displacement worldwide. As we can see from this graph, in blue, the number of internally displaced people now at, I think, over 55 million, vastly surpass other groups of people, including refugees in yellow. And as Bjorn had said in the introduction, internal displacement is a pressing international humanitarian issue with broad consequences for local security and stability. And like refugees, these populations often face prejudice where they settle as well. But they've been largely understudied in the literature. And so our research question in this paper is, can prolonged social contact reduce local residents' negative attitudes towards internally displaced persons in fragile and violent settings? Here, we're building on a vast literature called intergroup contact. Intergroup contact was, originally articulated by Gordon Allport in the 1950s, when he and other scholars were really studying racial desegregation in the United States, desegregation in institutions like public schools, public housing, and the military. And here, the contact hypothesis posits that interpersonal contact between people from two different groups, some sort of social identity boundary like race, religion, that this contact can promote and increase tolerance and friendships and reduce prejudice, particularly under these three conditions when there's equal status among the groups in contact, when the groups are working cooperatively towards common goals, and when that contact is supported by local institutions and authorities. And so this is a pretty well-established, really intuitive theory, but a lot of the research so far has been, a lot of it has been observational, meaning that we might be concerned about selection bias, in which, how do we know that more contact is leading to less prejudice, and not simply that people who are less prejudiced seek out more contact, for example. And so a couple meta-analyses have told us that there's been few experimental work on this in the real world settings, particularly in non-Western contexts. And there's been few randomized control trials, particularly in active conflict settings. Here are some recent exceptions: a study in Nigeria and Iraq, and a few other studies in Israel. And within this literature, migrant status has also been largely overlooked. Most of this literature looks at race or religion, but migrant status, we think, can also be quite an important outgroup identity category. In terms of policy, we also know that there's been billions of dollars spent on programs like the one that we study on vocational training to try and reduce violence in wartime settings. And for this project, we're also drawing on this large literature on prejudice and prejudice reduction towards migrants. And so we hope our study, builds on all of these literatures. So let me tell you some more about the program that we're looking at. It was called INVEST, and it was conducted by Mercy Corps. And so here, the INVEST program was conducted specifically in Kandahar, Afghanistan. We know Afghanistan has one of the largest IDP populations in the world. At the period of our study, which was 2016 and 2017, there were about 1.3 million IDPs in Afghanistan. I think now the number has increased to about 4 million. This was a program designed by Mercy Corps in order to reduce unemployment. The program really had nothing to do with improving attitudes towards migrants. There was no component in the program that was about prejudice reduction specifically. And so for us, I think it's a really naturalistic setting. It has a lot of external validity because, as I said, there's been a lot of similar programs in active conflict settings. We also think that it minimizes self-selection because the participants who joined the program, who I'm going to discuss a little bit more later, these participants, they didn't join the program, because they felt any which way towards prejudice. They were there to learn a vocational skill in order to reduce unemployment. We also think this might minimize reporting bias because, again, the program had nothing to do with prejudice. The program itself enrolled more than 2,500 participants, both men and women. And they were randomized either into taking this vocational course right now, or they were put on a wait list to take this course in the future. So that waitlisted group is our control group. What's great about this program is that half of them were basically IDPs from the area of Kandahar. The other half were locals to Kandahar. And so unlike many other studies out there on contact that really just bring a few members of the out group, here it was split 50-50. And so we know that the IDPs in this program are not tokenized. The vocational training courses themselves lasted either 3 to 6 months, depending on the course. They met for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so this contact program, we think, is probably the largest program that we know of that's been tested experimentally. So participants basically met each other for 360 to 720 total hours. This compares really favorably to those other contact programs that I had mentioned earlier, where usually the total hours come out to be, 20 to maybe 60 total hours. But many other programs, the contact really just lasts for a day, so quite fleeting. The classes themselves naturally ranged from either about 30 to 60% migrants. So again, they were pretty balanced. And in post-program focus groups, we learned that participants were highly satisfied with the courses. They really liked the courses. They wished that the courses continued. And we can see that in our compliance rate. So we have almost 80% compliance rate, meaning the people who were assigned to treatment actually came and attended the courses. We also talked with the instructors of the training courses, and they reported that in the classes, they didn't notice any segregation by, locals versus IDPs. These were really quite small classes where participants had to work together on the trade that they were learning. So, for example, fixing cell phones together or fixing an engine together. So they worked very closely together. And here are just some photos from our program. For example, we had men and women in this program. I also want to point out that in this program, the locals and the IDPs had very similar characteristics on our covariates. So for example, they both had an average age of 20 years. They're quite young. Vast majority were of the Pashtun ethnicity. And in terms of employment status and net income, this was generally quite a vulnerable and young population. I think only maybe 20% had reported earning any income in the past month. We also really wanted to be mindful of ethical considerations. We understood that this is a vulnerable population, again, young, largely unemployed. They were experiencing ongoing conflict. Mercy Corps fielded this program a year prior to our study in a different province in Helmand to make sure that they could work out all the kinks of the program itself. For our surveys, we obtained informed consent and we didn't use any deception. We also organized safe travel and paid for transportation to and from the vocational training centers. This is really important for people living in the internally displaced settlements, for example. And again, we conducted focus groups and interviews to probe for any negative experiences or instances of discrimination, and we didn't find any there. So let me give you some background on what it's like being internally displaced in Kandahar. There was a lot of discrimination and prejudice faced by IDPs in Kandahar, especially, that locals had fears that these IDPs were going to be more susceptible to Taliban recruitment. They experienced police harassment, social exclusion, and a lot of difficulties in accessing public services. And so here are some quotes. This first Pashtun migrant was saying that, members of their family, they were attacked, and without local connections, they weren't able to get any help from the police. One of our training center directors also corroborated that migrants face miserable conditions and that there are some beliefs among locals that migrants, take their jobs. And so the hypotheses that we're testing in this study is that focusing on the locals here, that those who are treated, meaning they're getting the vocational training right now, so they're getting this intensive contact with IDPs, that they're going to report more positive views of the IDPs and more interactions with IDPs in general outside of the program. Number two, that these positive effects should be greater for those locals that are enrolled in the 6-month courses compared to those in the 3-month courses, because of course in the 6-month courses, they're getting a much larger dose. They're there with IDPs for half a year. Hypothesis 3, that those who are in more balanced courses, meaning their courses are 50-50, should also see larger and longer effects because these two groups are on more equal footing. And coming from the contact literature, that younger participants should also experience larger and longer positive effects compared to older participants. So how do we measure these attitudes? We conducted an endline survey at the end of the program, but we also conducted a second endline 8 months later because it was really important for us to measure long-term if there were any long-term changes in attitudes. Again, the literature so far generally just measure attitudes same day or right after the program. And so these were the questions that we asked. The first is, thinking about the past 6 months, approximately how much interaction did you have with IDPs in your community outside of our INVEST program? In general, what kind of effect do you feel that IDPs have on your community? And some people believe that these IDPs are more likely to support violence than local residents, that they'll take employment away from Native residents, and that they'll become a burden on government resources, for all these statements. Some people feel that way, others disagree. Where do you put yourself on that statement? And so here are baseline responses. So these are the responses before the program started. Of our local participants, you can see from the very first plot that half reported that they never had any interaction with IDPs. And then for the following questions, to read this graph, basically the leftmost bar is the more exclusionary response, the rightmost bar is the more inclusive response. And we can see that across those questions that it's basically normally distributed. What this tells us is that, there is some prejudice amongst our local respondents before the program on all of these questions, but it wasn't so high, it wasn't so, skewed to the left that we thought nothing is going to change their minds. So we're actually quite hopeful in our program. But, as you could tell from the title of our presentation, this is a null results paper. And so here I'm showing you the general results. These are just sort of modified difference in means estimate at end line 1, which is the top plot, and end line 2, the bottom plot. You can see across all the questions, basically no difference between treated locals and control locals. And so this is for everyone in our program. Next, we can compare those who were in the 6 months courses versus the 3-month courses. And we also see no difference here. We can also compare courses by their course composition. So was the course, did they have majority IDPs? Were they basically 50-50 in the class, or were the IDPs in the minority of the classroom? And here we also basically see no difference at end line 1 or end line 2. Next, we could look at some heterogeneous effects by participant demographics. And again, we largely see no difference comparing, men and women participants, those who are younger or older, Pashtun or not Pashtun, and those who had previously experienced violence. And so, across all of these results, we have a very precisely identified null. What does this mean? We have these null effects overall. And, one One possibility is that being in these courses might have heightened feelings of economic competition because, again, in these courses, there was nothing about prejudice reduction specifically in the curriculum. The courses were built around, learning vocational skills in order to become employed. And so it may be that the locals in this course, they were, interacting with IDPs and they just felt more economically competitive after the course. We think it's possible. But as you noticed, one of our questions on the survey asked about economic competition, and we didn't see any movement there. So even though, being in these courses didn't change attitudes, didn't, reduce prejudice, I guess the silver lining is it also didn't increase prejudice, which was a possibility. In line with some of the other studies, the Nigeria and the Iraq study, for example, they also found that in active conflict, it's really hard to change minds through contact, and our results are in line with that. It could simply be, we think, that in wartime, people's biases and stereotypes are used for survival. And so those beliefs, those negative beliefs, are very difficult to budge. We didn't really get to explore behavioral outcomes or cross-cutting identities in this survey. I think that's something important to explore in the future. And it could be that we think in this program, because there was no explicit anti-prejudice programming, it might have just been too subtle. It's very naturalistic in that these programs exist and they do put groups of people in contact with each other, but without more explicit anti-prejudice programming, things like perspective giving or perspective taking exercises, which we've seen some promising results on, it could just be that, it wasn't able to change attitudes. And finally, just zooming out, I think more and more these types of programs and interventions like diversity trainings or intergroup contact programs that are quite short term, these interventions are aimed at changing individuals' minds, but they might not be enough. I think what is necessary and for us to think about in terms of policy is what are the structural changes we can put in place to change minds. And by that, going back to Gordon Allport, the structural changes that he was interested in was desegregation of major institutions like public housing and public schooling. And so in our context, what are some, bigger structural changes that can be put in place to reduce prejudice of IDPs? Maybe things like, like in the previous presentation, having access to public schooling for children of IDPs and locals so that they can interact with each other from a very young age over a long course of time. And with that, I'll leave you with this photo from one of our classes of our participants, working on, I believe it's an engine together, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang, for that insightful presentation. I do invite you to keep your camera on for the couple, we've got about 5 minutes, let's say, for questions directed toward you. I see one was directed in the chat regarding whether there were disruptions during the conducting of the research, and I see that was addressed. But maybe we can ask you the second question that's in the chat here, which is, if I may paraphrase, what strategies did you use to minimize attrition? And then maybe second, given that there was a 50% IDP, non-IDP composition in the sample, would these effects, would these have effects been driven by this segregation of the subgroups? So perhaps you can address those, and we'll also again invite the floor for further questions. Over to you.
Yeah, to minimize attrition, and again, my co-author Jay is also in the audience, so he can feel free to chime in as well. To minimize attrition, Mercy Corps made sure that we provided daily transportation, and so we wanted to make sure it wasn't too difficult to get to the VTCs, the vocational training centers. The students themselves also, once they started the program, they had a lot of incentive to finish it because then they would get like a certificate of finishing the courses. And from our focus groups, most of the students wanted more courses. So attrition wasn't as much of a problem. We did have attrition in terms of measurement, especially in our second end line, because again, that end line happened 8 months later. So, I will admit it was difficult to find people again 8 months later to take our second survey. In order to do that, we just had some, the usual survey incentives. But given attrition in the paper, we do some robustness checks specifically surrounding the attrition, like using multiple imputation and other strategies. The second question, given that there was a 50-50 IDP and non-IDP composition in the sample, this effect may be driven by segregation by subgroups. I think this question is about, is it subgroups within either group? In case they're, maybe, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but it could be something about cross-cutting identities, for example. So we know that almost all of our participants were of the Pashtun ethnicity. So it wasn't like, for example, the IDPs were of one ethnicity and the locals were of another. That being said, there are some differences in tribe. And so I think, that could be.
Maybe I can follow on that. There's a related question, maybe just on the issue of there was a question whether locals were dropping out when they find out their peers were IDPs, and maybe I had a question on that. Were the IDPs, was there clarity that the IDPs would self-identify as IDPs during the course of the program? Maybe that. And then we have two more questions for you to address. One, which is, does your data show important correlational predictors of attitudes towards IDPs that suggest interventions for future RCTs? So maybe a public policy question here in terms of the correlational predictors. And then one last one, which is maybe a little bit more about why conflict setting is such a key characteristic in this context. A question from the floor on that. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Those are excellent questions. Did IDPs self-identify? I don't think they needed to self-identify. And of course, Jay can jump in here as well. It was very apparent to participants and instructors which of them were IDPs and which weren't, and that largely had to do where they were coming from. And so the IDPs were largely living in settlements, and we have a map in the paper to show where they were. And so it would be apparent, in the first few weeks, like, hi, where are you coming from? That they were coming from the IDP settlement areas. They also, buses would come from that area, so they would come off the bus together. And so it was pretty obvious, and we, asked our instructors that too, who were IDPs and who were not. In terms of program attrition, we didn't see that, for example, locals differentially attrited compared to IDPs. And so I think some of the attrition had to do with, I think maybe people just finding jobs in the middle of the 6 months program. So people who started earning an income would leave, which that makes sense. But it didn't have to do with locals leaving because they didn't want to be in classes with IDPs, for example. To Dan's question, that's a great question. I don't think we looked at this. This is a really great question, something for me to think about and follow up with you on. And to Jeremy's question on why is conflict setting important? It's really important because a lot of this literature on intergroup contact, they're looking at groups that, are outgrouped to each other, but most of this literature is not in a conflict setting. And so, a lot of this is, a lot of this work has been done, and importantly done in sort of lab-like settings, not naturalistic settings, lab-like settings in universities, for example. And so you can imagine, university students in a lab-like setting, that's going to be a really different dynamic from people who are living in active conflict settings. And we think it's really important to measure these interventions precisely in the places where the policy would be for those people, right? If we think that these types of programs work, we want them to be implemented in conflict settings for groups that are outgroups. But I wanted to note, of course, that in this conflict setting, the active conflict, of course, is not between, the violent conflict is not between locals and IDPs, right? It's between the Taliban and the government. And so that's an important distinction there compared to similar studies that were done in Nigeria and Iraq, for example, where the two groups that they're studying are the ones that are in violent conflict against each other.
Thank you for that. Maybe just one last quick question for you from the floor, and then we'll have to move on, which is regarding the economic or vocational outcomes of the program. Were there implications or effects on the outcomes of the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a separate paper on looking at the economic outcomes as well as attitudes, specifically support for the Afghan government versus the Taliban. And there in that paper, we did see some positive but quite small effects on the economic outcomes. So that was promising. The story got a lot more complicated in terms of support for government or the Taliban, but I'll share this paper as well. It's also cited in this paper, so you please read that paper if you're interested in that part of the. Yeah, and Jay just shared the link to the earlier paper.
Great. Thank you so much for that, for the insights and for your sharing, and also the excellent questions that are coming from the floor. We do encourage more of that for the next presentation. So with that, maybe I can invite Alexandra Hartman on to join us on screen once again for the next paper, which is Violence, Displacement, and Support for Internally Displaced Persons, Evidence from Syria. Papers by Alexandra C. Hartman, Benjamin S. Morse, Sigrid Weber as well, and presenting on their behalf. Over to you, Alexandra.
Hi, so I've just been told by my computer that I'm not going to be able to share unless I restart this application. So it might make sense for another person to go for me because I didn't realize that was going to be the case. Apologies for not having set my technical system up in advance, but I didn't do that. So
no objections from my end on that. Let me just double check. Is the next presenter Sandra? Are you ready and able to come on screen and join us?
my sincere apologies to whoever is being inconvenienced by this.
We'll give Sandra Sequeira just a moment to join us on screen, if she can. Just need 1 minute is what she says. Maybe we can go to our fourth one then Laura, who is quite active in the chat. Laura, can we ask you to join us on screen here? She says, sure. So Laura will swap around the presentations. This one is on Displacement, a step on women's marriage, natural disasters and cultural norms by Laura Munoz Blanco. So Laura, over to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Well, so I'm delighted to present this work in progress paper, but first of all, let me show my gratitude to the organizer for including this paper in this amazing program. So let me start presenting what is my research question. So this paper studies how forced displacement affects the timing of marriage of displaced young women. But the question here is why we should care about this question, right? So first of all, marriage outcomes, notably age of marriage, is a major factor of human capital investment, fertility preferences, and economic powers of women, but also for health outcomes of children. But what is important here is that recent estimates documents that the timing of marriage responds to negative economic shocks. But however, even forced displacement could be a major economic shock for the marriage market. There are still many theoretical and empirical buffers on the effect of forced displacement on the timing of marriage. And as many of you know, displacement is not a minor shock, right? Today, 1% of humanity is displaced, and there are more than twice a forcibly displaced population than in 2001. And displacement differs from other income shock because it's a shift in the demographic composition of marriage market at origin and destination. But what I would like to highlight is that 86% of the forcibly displaced population in the world are hosted by developing countries. Countries where marriage is often regulated by traditionally cultural norms. And these norms that sometimes could be socially undesirable, but they are able to alleviate marketing, to provide better market outcomes by alleviated marketing completeness. And for the concept of traditional cultural norms, I would like to invite you to think about dowry and bride price, that is a bride payment, post-marriage residency, multiple spouses, and as well the role of women in agriculture. So under this motivation, this paper examines if and how forced internal displacement affect the timing of marriage, and particularly the hazard into marriage before the age of 18 of displaced young women. And the major threat for answering this sort of question is to find a shock for displacement that is exogenous to the timing of marriage. So to do so, I use the staggered occurrence of the static earthquakes in Indonesia to implement a difference in defense approach. And first of all, this approach allowed me to answer a preliminary question, that is how earthquakes affect the timing of marriage. But once again, my research question is how displacement, how forced internal displacement affect the timing of marriage. So to do so, I'm going to run a difference in different decomposition by a sample of displaced women. And I will present during this presentation how this paper addressed the self-selection issue that is one of the main threats for the identification. And as a second part of this project, I profit from ethnicity level variation in the persistent engagement in marriage customs to look at if indeed displaced households take advantage of their customary norms to cope with the negative economic shock of displacement. And what I find? So what I find is that displacement indeed accelerated the timing of marriage, and the effect corresponds to an increase of 47% in the annual marriage hazard. But what is important is that this average effect masks an important heterogeneity that depend on traditional custom, such as a payment from the groom to the bride family at the moment of the marriage, that is the bride price, but also depend on the matrilocal tradition. And what is the matrilocal tradition? So it's a tradition whereby the husband joins the wife household at the moment of the marriage. And these results suggest two of the proposed mechanisms of this paper. First of all is that displaced parents might seek to anticipate the marriage of their young daughters by alleviating the financial constraints through the acquisition of this payment from the groom at the moment of the marriage. But also matrilocal tradition is an additional incentive for displaced parents, because it means that they not only keep the support of their daughters, but also it's a way to increase the aggregate household labor return through the new member that is the son-in-law, that is the future husband of their daughters. And as a third proposed mechanism is that marriage might be a quick way to assimilate with the local population at destination. And assimilating at destination, it might be as well, might lead to increase the socioeconomic networks, and as well could be a coping strategy with the economic shock of displacement. As a last part of this paper that I will present today, I study how a policy change can address the underlying mechanisms that lead to anticipating the marriage of young women by providing parental incentive, precisely by providing monetary incentive, by unconditional funds transfer. And indeed, what I find some preliminary results is that the unconditional funds transfer mitigate the effect of displacement on the timing of marriage. So let me start with the first question, that is the main research question of this project, that is how forced internal displacement affect the timing of marriage. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to use the staggered occurrence of the destructive earthquake in Indonesia. But the question is, why Indonesia? Well, Indonesia is one of the countries with the highest exposure to big destructive earthquakes, given its location on the Ring of Fire. But why earthquakes? Because earthquakes strike suddenly and cannot be predicted. And unfortunately, they had the potential to displace thousands of people. In this paper, I look at forced internal displacement, because the majority of the population that is forced to displace due to natural disasters remain within the national borders. And in line with Gino and Menendez, I'm going to start defining the destructive earthquake. as those earthquakes with an intensity of at least 7 in some of his locations affected. And as you can see, there is a staggered occurrence of this destructive earthquake across time and space in Indonesia. And this variation comes from the United States Geological Survey that gives me the data on the location at sub-district level, but also year month of each earthquake. And what is my main data source? So is Indonesia Family Life Survey. It's an individual level longitudinal survey in this country. It has been conducted for the last 21 years in 13 out of the 27 provinces. And what is one of the main features that I would like to highlight and stress is the low attrition rate of this longitudinal survey. Almost 87% of individuals are interviewed in all the 5 rounds. And one amazing feature is that it gathers data on current and retrospective marriage behavior of individuals. And this data allow me to define my outcome, that is age of entry in marriage market, using the year of the first marriage. But as well, this data allow me to track individuals over time and across space, because it gathers information on current and retrospective mobility behavior of individuals. And this data enabled me to build my displacement variable. But jumping to the sample, in order to avoid restricting my sample to never, in order to avoid excluding never married women, I'm gonna restrict my sample to those women that are at least 23 years old at the last round. And as well, I'm gonna further restrict my sample in order to make sure that they are interviewed in my time horizon to those women that are born after 1980. And as I said at the beginning, one important threat for the identification is self-selection. So what I'm going to do in the next 2 slides is how I overcome with this limitation. So testing self-selection into displacement. The question here is why, if earthquakes in this are the pull factor. So what I am doing to try to overcome. So first, I restrict my sample, my earthquake sample, to those earthquakes that are big enough. And I believe that with this approach, I'm able to decrease the scope for self-selection. But of course, it is undeniable that there are some socioeconomic differences between displaced and non-displaced women. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to control image baseline specification for these differences that are the number of siblings, that are as well religion being masculine or not, father education and mother education, and as well as the controls that I will introduce in the next slides. But what is reassuring is that the probability of displacement increase with the intensity of a earthquake, as you can see on the figure number 2. But what is the difference between a magnitude and an intensity? Well, whereas there is one single magnitude at the epicenter, each earthquake has the potential to create different intensities in the surrounding areas. And this data comes as well for the United States Geological Survey. And as a further test as well, I would like to stress that the results do not change by subsample of earthquake intensity. And what is the impression of these results is that if the estimates change by subsample of earthquake intensity, it might suggest that my results are driven by self-selection. And what about self-selection into destination? Where they move and why they move to those locations? So 69%, 68.66%, 66% of women move within the same district. So let me clarify what is the administrative division of Indonesia. So Indonesia is divided into different provinces. A province is divided into different districts, and a district is divided into different sub-districts. So what does it mean when I said that almost 69% of women migrate or displace within the same district? It means that I think that we are comparing the same marriage market. But an additional concern is that we might be a little bit worried that those women that are more prone or less prone to get married get out of my sample. But only 3.39% of women move to a non-Indonesian Family Life Survey province. As well, I ran further robustness tests for testing the attrition. And as well, one further test that I do is I restrict my sample to those women with a female siblings, trying to compare the SR of getting married with the female counterfactual within the same family. And the estimates do not change. And what I'm trying to do next because I'm trying to understand why they moved to this location, trying to see the ethnicity composition at destination before the haircut is driven this sort of selection. So what is my empirical strategy? So before presenting the empirical strategy, let me remind you once again, what is my research question? So the main research question of this paper is how post-internal displacement affect the timing of marriage. And I employ a difference in difference approach. How exploiting the staggered occurrence of destructive haircuts across sub-districts and year month in Indonesia. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to try to present what is my baseline specification or my empirical specification and present the results of what. First, if haircut affect the timing of marriage, and then I will jump to my main research question, that is how displacement affect the timing of marriage by looking at difference in different discomposition by displaced women sample. And then I will present that the results are robust to a bunch of robustness tests. So the empirical specification, so I use simple discrete approximation of a duration model to evaluate the duration that women spend without entering the marriage market after a haircut, precisely after a haircut that induced the displacement. And to do so, I restrict or I convert my data set into a woman age panel by year month level. And I further restrict my duration of interest from the age of 12 to the age of the first marriage. Why the age of 12? Because it's the age that women are first at risk of getting married. And what is going to be my baseline specification? So I'm going to regress my outcome of interest, that is 1 in the year the woman gets married, 0 otherwise, on what is my treatment, that is 1 if exposed to a haircut at the time, at the month TM, sorry, and in the sub-district where they are located, right, and 0 otherwise. And I'm going to include the individual level coverage that I mentioned before, that is, once again, being masculine or not, number of siblings, parents, father education and mother education, but as well, I'm going to control for GR island fixed effect, as well age fixed effect to account for different probability of getting married at different age, year of month fixed effect, that is the coastal fixed effect, and then urban-rural fixed effect. And my error term is clustered at district level. What are the main results? So starting with the effect of haircut, we see that the haircut affect the timing of marriage. And in average term, the effect corresponds to an increase in the annual marriage ASR that corresponds to 18% in this increase. But looking at these results by age, we can see in this figure 3 that the effects are concentrated at the age of 16 and as well at the age of 21, right? So it means that haircuts affect the early marriage, so it means marriage before the age of 18, but as well after the 18. And what is the identification assumption of these results is the parallel trend, right? So it means that in the absence of treatments, women exposed and not exposed to haircuts might evolve similarly. So I provide some evidence of the parallel trends using an event study, and what we can see is that there is no difference between women exposed and not exposed to haircuts during the 5 years leading up the haircut, right? But as I said, my question is how displacement affect the timing of marriage. And we can say that displacement accelerates the timing of marriage and the effects are larger, right? So the effect in average term correspond to 47% increase in the annual marriage ASR, and breaking down the results by age in this figure number 5, we can see how the effects are highly concentrated after the age of 20. And looking at early marriage, we can see how event displacement decrease the early marriage. So it means marriage below the age of 18. Well, during the next slide, so during the rest of this presentation, I would like to provide some reasons or some hypotheses of these results. But let me stress that the results are in line with the literature, especially with the paper that was presented at the last conference, that is Lu and co-authors, where they saw that young displaced women are more likely to get married compared with adult women. Okay, so these results are robust to a bunch of robustness tests. Let me highlight, for instance, displacement definition, counterfactual definition. I'm gonna skip this part for the sake of time, but as well is robust for the standard indifference checks that I'm still working on. I ran some of them, but not all, but working on. But let me start the second part of this paper and for this presentation. That is how marriage norm affect the effect of displacement on the timing of marriage. So to do so, I'm gonna use data from the ethnographic atlas that give me information on the transfer at marriage and as well post-marriage residency. So I'm gonna exploit the within country variation in whether bride price is practiced or not. Let me remind you what is a bride price. So bride price is a payment from the groom to the bride's family at the moment of the marriage. And why only bride price? Because none of the ethnic groups in Indonesia traditionally practice dowry. And why it's important to look at bride price? Because the value of this payment could be higher than a year income. And as well, I exploit the within country variation in matrilocality versus non-matrilocality. So what is matrilocality is where the husband joins the wife's household at the moment of marriage. However, matrilocality and neolocality is when they move to the husband community or they settle down in a new household. So as I said, matrilocality means an additional incentive because for displaced partners, it means that they keep the support of the young daughter, but also they increase the aggregate labor return of the household through the labor composition of the labor return from the son-in-law that is the future husband of the daughter. So what are the results of the marriage customs? So what we can see in the table number 1 is that all the estimates are significant, regardless the tradition, regardless if they are engaged in bride price or non-bride price, and as well in kinsman tradition. But what we can see in the panel A is that the estimate is 53% higher among bride price women compared with non-bride price women subsample. And the same logic in the panel B, where the estimates for matrilocal women is 71% higher compared with non-matrilocal subsamples. And these results are robust to resistance of other cultural norms, that is polygyny and matrilineality. But these results suggest 2 of the proposed mechanisms that I said at the beginning, right? So the first is that bride price as a consumption is moving channel. As well, what I do in the paper, I use contemporary payment to test if the payment changed with the level of education, and indeed the payment increased with the education level of women. And the second mechanism is the matrilocal tradition, because it's an additional incentive and it might lead to increase the household labor return through this new member. That is the husband, the husband of the young daughter. And as a third proposed mechanism is that marriage might be a quick way to assimilate with the local population. So to do so, what I do is that using the involvement in local organization and destination, I saw that the displacement effects, right, the estimate of displacement on the timing of marriage decrease with the engagement, with the community engagement at destination. And as well, I rule out other channels that I will invite you to look at the paper. I will share a draft soon in my on my website. Sorry. And what I would like to jump on is that, in a nutshell, the results suggest that displaced parents use the marriage of the young daughters to cope with the economic shock of displacement. And why they do so? Well, so some of the proposed mechanisms is through the payment at the moment of marriage from the groom, and as well matrilocalities, new member in the household and increment the household return, but as well is assimilation into destination. But what I'm going to do next is I'm trying to see if a policy change can mitigate this effect. So I'm going to use the unconditional cash transfer in Indonesia, given that the literature shows the positive impact of these programs on forcibly displaced population, and we have strong evidence today, this morning. And this Indonesian unconditional cash transfer was implemented in 2005 until 2014. And the targeting tool was the 2005 socioeconomic survey, and it was targeting the poorest. So the main limitation is that the unconditional cash transfer were randomly assigned. So to try to overcome with this main problem, I'm going to conduct a matching contrafactual or a matching method contrafactual. And so the intuition is that I'm going to try to compare the variation between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries with observably similar pre-program characteristics using the indicators that the socioeconomic survey used. So it's 15 questions that is targeting the household and as well label information. And what are the preliminary results? So what we can see in the figure number 7 is the effect of unconditional cash transfer on the probability of getting married by a subsample of displaced women. And what we can see is that unconditional cash transfer could be used as a mitigation policy, right? We can see how they decrease the probability of getting married. And the effects are larger among price women. So to conclude, what I showed you today, that displacement affect the timing of marriage and increase the probability of the annual marriage hazard in 47%, and the effect depends on the engagement in customs such as bride price and multi-local tradition. And this is two of the main proposed mechanisms, that is bride price as a consumption moving channel, and as well multi-local tradition as a coping strategy. And a third mechanism is necessity to assimilate with local population. But there are some policy implications that emerge from this finding. First is that my results shed light on the fact that the negative impacts of displacement start at an early age. So I think that by documenting one of the potential causes of the anticipation of marriage, this paper will help to find some potential well-advised policy that could contribute to decrease the effect of displacement on children and teenagers. And secondly, this paper, these findings highlight the importance of culture in shaping the economic behavior of displaced population. So studying the consequences of cultural norms is important for the policy design and evaluation. And lastly, this effect contributes to the global and current discussion on the impacts of climate change and its unequal geographical and gender distribution. So thank you so much. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that insightful presentation and modeling as well. We have a comment in the chat regarding a recommended work here on marriage as a strategy to smooth consumption, not only at the immediate negative shocks, but also in the longer term. And we also have a question here, which is, if we take a step back, what are the broader implications for gender empowerment and long-run resilience of your results? So maybe I can ask you to take a stab at that question. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ana Maria Ibanez. Thanks for sharing this paper. Yes, indeed. At the very beginning, I was thinking that was simply the network channel what was driving the results, right? But then looking at the cultural norms, they might be connected, right? And as well, it is not a substitution effect, right? So they complement each other. And of course, in the paper, as a further analysis, I look at the long-term effect of displacement, and indeed, the effects persist over time in the timing of marriage, but as well the timing of first fertility and other effects that I will be happy to share in the future. And the second question, to see research on gender dimension, one question, if we take a step back, what are the broader implications for gender empowerment and long-run resilience of the results? Thanks, Andres. Yes. So the motivation was driven by this consequence, right? So the timing of marriage, precisely the age of marriage, is an important consequence of the economic empowerment for women, right? But not also economic empowerment for women, but also fertility preferences and as well consequences for their children, right? So what I'm trying to do as well is look at and provide some further evidences of these consequences. So looking at labor outcomes and income outcomes in the long term. So I might think, without having evidence from my setting, that indeed that might have some consequences for the gender empowerment, because it means that they decrease their participation in the labor market out of their household. Of course, that they contribute in the labor within the household, but they not engaged in the labor market. Yeah. But thanks for the question, both of you.
Thank you, Laura. So just pausing here to see if there's additional questions. I see one just came in. How much of this could be driven by perceived returns to the education of girls and women in different host locations, or simply by disruptions to investments in education? Areas with prevalent bride price might be areas with low returns to education as well. Your thoughts on that question?
Yes, thanks, Sandra. So indeed, education is an important component in this setting. I didn't have that much time to say that indeed the effect of displacement on the timing of marriage by bride price and local women is strongly affected by the level of education, right? Indeed, the probability of getting married restricting for these women is affected by the education. So how, as a mechanism, if there is specific education of girls, it might be the case that the perceived returns of education might affect the results. Of course, the literature is highlighting that the marriage outcome is affected by the return of education. So of course, it might be an important aspect to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one hand raised from the floor. I see Laura Brinks from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs with your hand up. So why don't we call on you, and I'll ask the administrators to please unmute you to raise your question.
I'm watching through the internet, and that's why I can't put it in the chat. So that's why I'm asking you the question this way. I also don't know how to turn on my camera. Apologies for that. Even after all these years of COVID meetings, they're still unknowns to me. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And my question was, because you went a little bit too fast for me at this part on the cash transfers. So I was just wanting to check with you whether I understood you correctly, that the cash transfers helps decrease the negative impact of marriage on young children or not. That was my question. Thank you very much.
No problem. Yeah, I apologize that I should decrease. I should present slowly. Yeah. So having said that, what I tried to highlight with that slide is that the effect of displacement on the timing of marriage is mitigated when a household is a beneficiary for unconditional cash transfer, right? This is what I'm showing, that it is no difference for the 3 years before the first year of receiving the unconditional cash transfer. But however, we can see how the effect of the timing of marriage by this transfer decrease since the year after and the years following the first year of the unconditional cash transfer. So yeah, that is the idea.
Great, and I think we just have a few more seconds. If I might use my position to ask you a question, which is, were you able to model, in terms of the definition of displacement as an exposure or a shock, in terms of repetitive displacement or the length of that displacement or the degree of that displacement on not only the individuals or the households, and maybe also linked to that, were you modeling also the displacement status of both parties to the marriage in terms of on both sides? Was there a correlation there? And with that last question, I'll hand to you before we move on to the next presentation.
Okay, yes, thanks, Samuel. So what I'm doing in the paper, the amazing data that I have, Indonesia Family Life Survey, as I said, allow me to track individuals over time and across the space. So I have data on the month and year when they move. I have the data on the year and month when the earthquakes occur, and then I know the sub-district of origin and the sub-district of destination. So I'm able to know when they move precisely, right? And I start defining displacement, but then I use different definition of displacement, and the results remained constant. And about the model, in the paper as well, I create a theoretical framework, right? Trying to provide some evidence of this mechanism from a theoretical perspective. And coming to the matching, one of the additional analyses that I ran is looking at the matching process during displacement, right? So I look at if there are some differences in the age gap between husband, the groom, and the bride, and as well education gap. And then as well, I look at if indeed the displaced women get married only with displaced grooms, and that is not the case, right? I do not see that displacement affect age gap, education gap, or if they increase the likelihood of getting married with displaced men. That is not the case.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Alexandra, I think we've already given you an introduction, but if I may invite you on screen again to share your screen with us for this paper, Violence, Displacement, and Support for Internally Displaced Persons, Evidence from Syria. Alexandra, over to you. And you may still be on mute, so just to remind you to unmute when you're ready to speak.
Okay, is it working now? I'm sorry, I have so many technical difficulties.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, and is it just sharing my preview or is it sharing my entire computer screen? I'm sort of enlarging it, but I've never worked with WebEx before. Apologies for this.
I believe it's showing your entire computer screen.
You may want
Okay.
to click on View at the top and then go to full screen.
Okay, yeah, apologies for not knowing how to do this. Okay, thank you so much for having me, and also thank you to Laura, who was willing to go in advance of her slot in the program. I really appreciate your flexibility. And I'm presenting some joint work today with Ben Morse, who's currently at Social Impact, and also Sigrid Weber at UCL. And as Samuel mentioned, this project is entitled Violence, Generosity, and Politics, Evidence from IDP Hosting from the Syrian Crisis. So a bit like the first paper, this project is looking at IDPs who are fleeing violence. And as the first presentation that we saw pointed out, there are a huge number of internally displaced people in the world today, a higher number than at any time since the end of World War II. And as a result, we're really in search of information and policies that can support this very vulnerable population. Two things that we're interested in trying to understand about folks who have to flee violence are the individual choices that they have to make, and then also how they interact with host communities and people who they encounter when they're fleeing violence. And so one of the questions we're going to address in this project is how individual choices to help each other, how people help each other in conflict can be explained. And then in addition to that, we're going to look at violence as a cross-cutting identity, so the experience of violence and how that might shape identity and generosity during conflict. So a preview of the results that I'm going to present today is that individuals that experienced high levels of violence and displacement during the first part of the Syrian civil conflict are more responsive to the needs of other Syrians who have been also displaced by violence. And they're also willing to extend their generosity across some intergroup boundaries. But not all boundaries are the same. And so the political salience of different identities really matters in who is willing to help in times of need. And so this finding is based on a conjoint survey experiment and observational data on IDP hosting from conflict affected individuals in areas outside of government Syria control in North and South Syria. And the data was collected in 2018. So I'm just quickly going to go through some of the theories and the conceptual framework that we're working with in this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. I'll talk about the data, our strategy, and then present the results. So two things that we know about the way that violence can affect people. One is a theory of parochial altruism, which many of you will be familiar with. And this is the idea that violence can cause in-group solidarity and out-group aggression. One of the questions we might have about this is sort of under what conditions we would expect parochial altruism to be the strongest. And I think also related to the first presentation, we might expect that ongoing conflict would be a time when in-group solidarity could be very high, and that out-group aggression could also be high. There's another set of research that has explored post-traumatic growth, and I think key to this research agenda has been the post. And this set of research has found that violence can lead to greater pro-social behavior after conflict. And this literature hasn't really focused as much in the past on intergroup behavior. So it has focused on things like voting or civic participation, but less about how people treat each other necessarily. And the mechanisms that link violence to post-traumatic growth are probably could be fleshed out a bit more. And the evidence also often comes from homogenous settings, and it could be quite consistent with parochial altruism, which is to say that you might experience violence and then that experience might lead to post-traumatic growth, but only in the activities that you do with members of your own in-group as opposed to members of the out-group. So one of the things we're going to explore in this project is the idea of empathetic altruism, which is the idea that a shared experience of violence or hardship can increase empathetic concern between individuals, and that this empathetic concern can transcend identity boundaries and motivate altruistic behavior towards in-group and out-group others. And so the idea here is that even if I'm the member of one group and you're the member of another group, if we both have experienced violence, and if this experience of violence is quite salient in our interaction, it might be that that shared experience creates a bridging identity that in fact overrides perhaps the difference in our identity at the group level. And so the observable implication of this would be that violence-affected individuals and communities will exhibit greater altruism towards both in-group and out-group others. And I want to just pause here to say that this idea came from work that I have done in other settings outside of Syria, and I'll refer to this in a moment, where I observed really high levels of generosity from host communities towards other displaced people. And one of the things that came out of that experience was host community members talking about how they themselves had experienced generosity when they had fled violence and conflict, and how that shaped the decisions they were making to be generous and support displaced people in times of crisis. Okay, so I've just made reference to this, and here I'll report the results of an earlier paper. And this research was conducted in Liberia. And so what we find in that context is that individuals and communities that experienced high levels of violence during the Liberian Civil War, they are less biased against out-group refugees and more responsive to refugee distress in a survey experiment. They host more in-group and out-group refugees in total, and they host a higher percentage of refugees that are sick or fleeing direct violence as opposed to indirect violence. And these results hold for communities, including diverse communities that experience violence. And so here are some results from that Liberia study. And you can see that as the number of violent experiences that an individual reports experiencing increases, that their willingness to host other individuals who have characteristics associated with need, for example, being a female-headed household, being a farmer, or being a family that is hungry, increase, whereas the effect of being a co-ethnic or a co-religious, a member of the same religious group, decrease as violence increases. So one of the motivations was to move from that study context to another context, which had some similarities, which would also quite different. I think we were a bit surprised by the strength of the finding, despite the anecdotal evidence that motivated the study. We wanted to understand how this traveled across time and space. So in both contexts, we have strong religious and ethno-linguistic divisions. There was ongoing violence in Syria at the time that we did this work, whereas in Liberia, the violence was more limited. There were some cross-border attacks, but it was not at the same scale. In both cases, we have diverse populations, we have partitioned ethnic groups, we have and understanding that identity really matters. So ethnic linguistic identity, religious identity map on to wartime cleavages, so the stakes are quite high. And so we want to understand how the context might shape a finding. Okay, so here's a map. This is just to recall that for this project, we're focusing on Syria. This is in 2017, and we can just see that we have a very, very high number of IDPs inside of Syria at this time, much higher than the refugees outside the country. So this is a serious issue. Also, given issues of access, for those of you who might have worked on that conflict, humanitarian access was quite restricted at different points. And so a lot of humanitarian service provision was limited in various ways. And we can understand that host communities and other regular people were kind of the frontline provider of support to internally displaced people. So we're curious about sort of that behavior. So 6.2 million IDPs inside of Syria, the largest IDP population in the world. Host population are key providers. There's a high cost to hosting with limited benefits. And the key factor here is that there are many hosts, not all, but many who were themselves displaced during the conflict at some earlier point. And so we're interested in how that experience would then shape their hosting behavior going forward. So we're going to work with a humanitarian partner, and we're going to identify areas where they have access. This shows a general area of study, nothing more specific than that is unembargoed. This is where we were able to partner with them for data collection. So the data collection was part of a humanitarian needs assessment, and it was collected in December and January 2017, 2018 in areas outside of GOS control. We have a sample of 70 communities and neighborhoods selected at the census level 4 with accessible subdistricts, and it's proportional to the population and the proportion of IDPs being hosted in the subdistrict according to the 2018 HNO. And within our sample, we end up with Sunni Muslims who are Syrian, they're Arabic speakers for the most part. And then we end up with Syriac Christians who are also Arabic speakers from North and South Syria. So here's a photo of data collection. And this was embedded in a survey which collected information on legal identity and documentation. It included questions on wartime experiences. It included data on IDPs hosted, some demographic characteristics, and then a survey experiment which we used to measure hosting preferences, as well as observational data about hosting experiences. So we use a choice-based conjoint experiment where respondents can imagine themselves in an IDP crisis. They have a limited capacity to host a family in need. They have to choose between hypothetical families where the attributes are randomly assigned. And these are the attributes that we use. We look at the status of the head of the household. We look at ethnicity, so either someone who speaks the same language as you or someone who speaks a different language. We look at two religious groups, Christians and Muslims, occupation, and the health of the child. We use pictographs in the delivery of the conjoint. This was in part to maintain the same procedure that we used in Liberia. We also found that it was an easier way of kind of keeping the specific trait we were focused on very centered during the delivery of the survey experiment. So the interpretation of our attributes is that need is indicated by the health of the children in the household and also the gender of the household head. We look at identity through whether the potential family you might host is from the same linguistic group as yourself or not. And so in this case, this is whether the family is Arabic speaking or whether they're Kurdish speaking, and also whether the family is either Christian or Muslim. And we look at material motivations by looking at the occupation category. So we're going to estimate hosting preferences, and I'm going to, I think, move through this slide. But we basically, one point of note is that we asked each respondent to identify 3 families. So we did 3 rounds with 2 choices per round. And then one of the things we're very much interested in, as I identified at the beginning of the presentation, is whether experiences of violence in the past are going to interact with the way that you make a decision about who to host. So we measure violence with a 4-component index that includes the whether the host themselves has ever been displaced, whether the household family member, whether a household family member was killed during the conflict, and whether primary residence or business was destroyed. And then in addition to that analysis, we're also going to do an observational analysis where we assess the relationship between the past experience with violence and displacement and actual hosting behavior. So this is measured in some different ways. We look at a dichotomous outcome about whether the respondent is currently hosting IDPs. We also look at a continuous outcome of the total number of IDP months, which is to say the number of months where you were hosting any IDPs over the course of the crisis. And then we can control for a range of covariates. However, we probably should be concerned, and we are concerned about the fact that there's selection into violence. And so in the paper, which you should feel free to take a look at if you're interested, we run a sensitivity analysis to try to understand what unobservables, if any, might be affecting this analysis. Okay, so what we can see is that these attributes do have a differential effects in terms of who is being selected to be hosted. And so we can see in particular that sick children, families with sick children, or families that are indicated to be speaking Kurdish are less likely to be hosted. And then also that families that are identified as Christian within our sample are more likely to be hosted. So this is regardless of your experience with violence. And so there's an indifference over occupation and household composition. There's a preference for families with healthy children, which I think is not that surprising. There's a preference for the ethnic in-group over Kurdish IDPs. Again, you can recall that our sample is almost exclusively Arabic speaking. And there's a preference for Christians, and this is mostly driven by the Christian respondents in our sample. However, when we look at the differential choices made by those who have experienced high level of violence versus low level of violence, what we can see is the pattern starts to shift. So in fact, we don't see very much discrimination based on whether the head of the household is a female or whether they're a farmer versus a salaried professional. But we do see that for those who've experienced less violence, whether a child is said to be sick is much more influential on their choice. And so the more violence you've experienced, we would interpret this as evidence that you have a higher tolerance for a family that is in need. We can see a similar effect for hosting Kurdish-speaking displaced people. So again, if you've experienced high levels of violence, you are not making a decision on who you're going to host based on whether they are speaking a language that is different to yours. For a religious group, the pattern is a bit different here, right? So we can see that in fact, we still see an effect of hosting co-religionists, especially when you've experienced high levels of violence and low levels of violence. And I'll come back to that in the conclusion. Okay, so again, just to summarize, the respondents who experience violence or displacement are less likely to discriminate against Kurds. So the preferences for Arabs are attenuated, and they're less likely to discriminate against families that have children who are sick. And so again, the preferences for healthy families are attenuated by the experience of violence, but they do prefer to host members of their own religious group. And so violence and displacement do not affect preference for the gender of the household head or the occupation of the family, the head of the household. So to kind of conclude here, the results are in line with our predictions about violence and displacement, reducing ethnic outgroup discrimination, but there is still a preference for religious in-group in our data. And we believe there are sort of two mechanisms that could explain this, and these are not pre-registered. And so we did pre-register all of our other hypotheses, but we were kind of not expecting this particular finding. So this should be kind of understood as exploratory research and definitely requires kind of further exploration. But we find that in the conflict, or it's known in the conflict, that a lot of violence was based or targeted on religious identity. And so we might find that self-preservation is one of the things that is motivating discrimination based on religious group. And there also might have been perceptions, whether they're true or not is something else, that certain Christian populations were allied with GOS forces. And so people might have been reluctant to extend generosity to those populations within our study areas. And so that might explain some of the reluctance by Muslims to host Christians and reluctance of Christians to host Muslims. And so this political and strategic salience of group identity does actually shape whether this bridging identity that we also have located, whether that shapes generosity or not. Okay. Sorry that I'm having all these messages appear. And that is all.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that presentation. We have a few minutes here. I sent a reminder to all if you would like to put your questions in the chat or also raise your hand, and feel free to make a verbal intervention there. Feel free to do that now. Maybe a question from my end while we're waiting for some is the question of hosting or not, and I wonder if that's is that a binary question in term and were you able also to potentially look into different ways of not coexistence but the length of time or repeated you know, experiences, and also the after report of you know, how it went with, you know, and how they've experienced hosting themselves. So maybe just that to kick us off while we're waiting if other questions come in.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think that we are able to dig a little bit in with the observational analysis and just sort of the extent of refugee hosting. But I think that in both of the studies, the question is sort of about meeting an immediate need. And so the context is a bit the moment when you first have an influx of people into a community and we're making kind of an immediate decision. I think that's more analogous to the questions that we asked. And so whether you would support someone for sort of in the initial emergency phase. I think in reality, obviously, we know that hosting can be a very drawn out process and that IDPs can be displaced for long periods of time, and that coexistence is sort of a longer and integration, potentially cooperation. And so I think that this study doesn't really speak to that. It's not really clear how long this bridging identity would hold up necessarily, especially under conditions of really severe resource constraints. And so this maybe also speaks to the finding in the first paper about sort of how different groups get along and under what conditions they can cooperate. Maybe the conditions are kind of limited and when, in fact, they do.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the chat here regarding the interactions for exposure to violence. Were they included and reported with AMCE or marginal means? Was just an interaction with the levels, and how did you measure violence? Over to you.
Yeah, so they are interactions. There are AMCs, and we measure violence in several different ways. But we have a set of questions, and so we create a scale, I think, for the analysis that I'm showing in this presentation. And so we can look at sort of different types of violence, and then whether you are we can look at a count, and we run the analysis with some different ways of working with that measure. I think what I showed here is above or below the mean experience of violence in the sample.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that might be it for the questions I'm monitoring, and I don't see any more coming in here, either hands raised nor in the questions. So thank you very much again for presenting your research to us. Very, very insightful, very, very interesting. And we'll go ahead and move on to our final presentation. I see Sandra on the screen now. The next paper is Forced Displacement in Human Capital, Evidence from Separated Siblings by Giorgio Ciovelli, Elias Papagiannou, Stelios Michalopoulos, and presented by Sandra Seguera. Over to you. And just a reminder, if you're ready to speak, go ahead and unmute. Yeah. Yes, over to you.
Thank you, Samuel. And sorry for not making your job easier with our names, all four of us. But thanks a lot for having me here. This is indeed a joint work with Giorgio Ciovelli, Stelios, and Elia. Let me just make sure that this is okay. So this audience is quite familiar with the numbers. Laura actually mentioned them earlier as well. That by 2020, about over 80 million individuals have been forcibly displaced from their homes. So this means that one person becomes displaced every 3 seconds. Out of these, about 43% are crossing borders as refugees, while the majority are IDPs, so 57% of these. Now, while media attention has focused primarily on the impact of refugee flows in developed countries, these actually represent a fairly small percentage of these figures, about less than 15%. the key fact that I think Laura mentioned as well is that it's often overlooked, is that 85% of the world's displaced population actually lives in the developing world, 40% of which are children. Now, the number of refugees and IDPs in the developing world is actually expected to increase with worsening conflict in several countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, from the Tigray in Ethiopia to the South Sudan. In fact, today's figure is almost double that of 2010. But despite the increased importance of these flows, we actually have very limited evidence on what are the medium to long-term socioeconomic impacts of forced displacement in the global South. So conceptually, we're going to start thinking in this project about the impact of conflict as generating 1 out of 3 potential displacement scenarios. So the first one is that people can not be displaced. So they can stay behind in their places of birth, which may be urban or rural once conflict hits. They can become IDPs and be displaced into another rural location or to an urban setting. And finally, they can be displaced into a neighboring country, often to refugee camps. So today, about 1 out of 2 refugees who are living in a rural area are actually living in a managed refugee camp. Alternatively, they can settle in informal agglomerations that are usually set up close to the border. Now, each of these trajectories can be associated with very different types of socioeconomic outcomes. So a key channel that we're going to focus on in this paper is how different displacement scenarios can affect investments in human capital. So both one's incentives to invest and one's ability to do so, and how that can subsequently affect occupational choice. Obviously, these outcomes are important as potential drivers of development and growth. And yet the impact of being forcibly displaced into these different environments is theoretically ambiguous. So on the one hand, it's possible that disruption costs that come with displacement to a new place, when one is often joining in a different household, all of that can negatively impact schooling. On the other hand, displacement may change one's views in favor of investments in human capital, since investments in human capital represent a mobile asset that cannot be expropriated. So this idea is often referred to as the uprootedness hypothesis in the literature. But it's also possible that being forcibly displaced to a more developed locality creates incentives for increased investments in human capital due to the existence of thicker and more developed labor markets, which would be in line with the place-based effect literature. A second question that we pursue is whether forced displacement can have additional long-term effects, namely psychological trauma, impact on inter-community trust, social capital, among others. Now, the literature to date has made relatively limited progress on our questions due to several challenges. So first, it's usually the fact that data on displacement is often patchy. One of the key contributions of this paper is that we can exploit a very rich microcensus data from a protracted civil war that took place between 1977 and 1992 that displaced about 4 million Mozambicans. So it's one of the largest episodes of conflict-driven displacement in recent history, which is comparable only to the current crisis in Syria. So the full census allows us to reconstruct the displacement trajectories for almost 12 million people, which is a universe of the surviving population. Second, there are obviously important selection concerns. So conflict is not random. Household or locality characteristics can drive both selection into different types of forced displacement trajectories, but it can also drive human capital investments and occupational choice. And so to overcome this challenge, we're going to exploit the fact that families were large in Mozambique at the time, with a median number of children of about 6. And second, that during the chaos of war, several families are often split in a quasi-random way. So this is very common. It was common in Mozambique at the time. It's common in conflict settings today. And what this allows us to do is to exploit within family variation across siblings to try to control for individual and family level characteristics that could affect both the choice of displacement trajectory and decisions about schooling and employment. A third key contribution is that we're able to quantify whether the effects on human capital accumulation are driven primarily by place-based effects, so by the characteristics of the places people move to, or by uprootedness effects, so this incentive to invest in a mobile asset. Now, most work to date has focused on just one of these mechanisms, but we are able to observe them both in a unified framework. And lastly, the long-term effects of displacement on mental health and on civic trust have seldom been explored in the literature. We try to do so through a novel survey that we conduct 30 years after the war. So let me start by giving you some historical context. So Mozambique was and continues to be a primarily agricultural economy. Even before the Civil War, the employment share in agriculture was about 90%. Average years of schooling were quite low at 0.5 on average. The Civil War was extremely brutal. It lasted between 77 and 92. It was waged between the government-backed Frelimo and the Rhodesian South African-backed Renamo. But importantly here, what I would highlight is that it was a war that was fought primarily in the countryside, and the cities were fairly well protected, particularly the country's 3 largest cities. So to understand the impact of displacement trajectories, we rely on the 1997 census in Mozambique, which was the first census that was conducted 5 years after the end of the war. And what this allows us to do is to know where people were at 4 key points: at birth, where they were right before the war ended in 1992, where they resided in 1995, and then where they are in 1997. And so this is what allows us to reconstruct the displacement trajectories for the universe of the surviving population, so approximately 12 million people. From the census, we get information on family structure, educational attainment, sector of employment in 1997, so 5 years after the war. It also gives us some individual and household level characteristics, such as gender, age, household level offspring mortality, among others. To identify place-based effects, we digitize and geocode data on the existing railroad trade network in Mozambique prior to the war. We use data on the location of landmines as well, which were constraining movement and shaping displacement patterns as well at the time. We collect information on the location of primary schools, and to measure conflict, we expand the ACLED dataset, so the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. We do that ourselves to cover our period of interest using similar sources and similar methodology, from news cables to secondary literature and newspaper articles. So here's a breakdown for the full census and the different types of displacement trajectories that took place. Most of the results that I will be showing today correspond to this sample of 12 to 32-year-olds in 1997, precisely because we want to cover individuals who were of primary school going age during the conflict. So when they were making decisions to invest in schooling or not during the conflict years. So we can see that about 72% of the population did not move, remaining mostly in rural areas. About 6% of the population was displaced into neighboring countries, mostly into refugee camps, and about 21% of the population was internally displaced. Interestingly, these proportions are relatively similar to what we observe in other conflict settings, even today, such as in Syria. So the first thing that we do is to try to examine what drives displacement in our context. So we look at several potential factors, certain development proxies, such as population density, density of roads, railroads, presence of commercial hubs, colonial commercial hubs, primary school density. We also consider measures of conflict and geographic distance to different destinations, such as borders, so that you could flee to a neighboring country, and the large cities. Now, when we run a simple linear probability model to see whether these factors influence displacement, we get overall a weak model fit, which is perhaps consistent with the existing historical narratives and reports on the fact that conflict in Mozambique, as it does in any other context, tends to have many idiosyncratic factors, unexpected twists and turns in the conflict process, and so displacement is not necessarily correlated very strongly with many of these factors. Among all the different drivers, the one that in relative terms seems to matter the most is location. So distance to borders and the main coastal cities is the best predictor of movement to these destinations. But importantly, there's a very weak and insignificant correlation between displacement and development, which is consistent with our hypothesis that what we're capturing in the data is indeed forced displacement during this period. So let me tell you a little bit more about each of these displacement trajectories, starting with the external displacement. So we think of external displacement as very much a continuation of a rural way of life. So schools were set up in these areas, either in UNHCR managed camps or in agglomerations that already had a significant number of Mozambicans, so close to the border. The emphasis was placed on primary education. Refugees did not have the legal right to work in the host country, and there were very few employment opportunities available. The vast majority of refugees did not have access to land, so they were given mostly free food, and other necessities were covered, and they remained largely dependent on foreign aid. There were about 18 camps in total. The majority of refugees and the camps were located in Malawi. And other refugees, there were 5 camps in Zimbabwe, 1 in South Africa, and some crossed the border into Tanzania, Swaziland, and other countries that did not have managed refugee camps. So there they were again settling mostly in informal settlements. Turning to internal displacement, so you can see that approximately, again, as I mentioned earlier, 21% of the Mozambican population was internally displaced at the time. Out of these, about 58% went to urban areas and 42% into other rural areas. Those moving into cities went mostly to the 3 largest cities in the country, so Maputo, Beira, and Nampula, as they offered some employment opportunities and they were heavily protected. So these maps here show the share of IDPs who were born in a rural area and went to an urban area. The map also identifies all the 12 largest cities, with Maputo here in the south, Beira, and Nampula as the 3 largest cities. What we find in these heat maps is that, not surprisingly, the movement to cities occurred mostly for those who were closer to cities to begin with, which is again what we found when we analyzed the correlates of displacement. When we look at those who moved from a rural area to another rural area, here the movement is a bit more widespread, so across the entire country. One note here is that there were about 12,000 individuals who also went from urban areas to the countryside during this period due to a government's forced villagization scheme. So we'll be able to also track what happens to this subset of the population who was forcibly moved to the countryside from an urban area, and how that affected their investments in education. So then the next step is to start by leveraging the full census, so the full sample of individuals in the census in 1997 who were aged between 12 and 32, and look at some correlational evidence, so linking the different displacement trajectories to investments in education and sectoral employment. So given the considerable differences between those who were born in a rural area and those who were born in an urban area, we run 2 different specifications. So we include in these specifications the different displacement trajectories, so whether they were externally displaced, internally displaced from rural to urban, internally displaced from rural to rural, and likewise, if they were urban born, those who went from urban to rural and urban to urban. So the omitted category here in the first specification is going to be the non-movers who were also rural born, and in the second specification will be the non-movers who were urban born. We include a host of individual characteristics as well, so gender and other age-specific constants, and we include district of birth fixed effects as well. So what we find is that the movement from a rural to an urban locality during the war is associated with a significant increase, about a 30% increase relative to the non-mover rurals. Here on the left-hand panel, I have the counterfactual being the rural non-movers. So those who went from rural to urban, here in the yellow bar, experienced a significant increase in the probability of schooling. Even just moving to another rural area already experiences a bump, about an 8 percentage point increase in the probability of schooling. Moving to a refugee camp across borders is, however, associated with no significant difference in terms of schooling attainment compared to someone who stayed behind in their rural area of birth. When we look on the right panel to those who are urban born, we find here that those who moved from one urban area to another urban area, so primarily moving from a smaller city to a larger city, also experienced a significant bump in the probability of schooling. And those who were forcibly moved under the villagization scheme actually experienced a decrease in the probability of investing in schooling. When we look at then occupational shifts, we find something similar. We find that the rural to urban displacement is associated with the largest shift out of agriculture into services. For the urban born, those moving again into into rural areas. Again, this yellow bar here on the right-hand side. When you move someone from an urban area to a rural area, they tend to then be engaged in agriculture 5 years after the end of the war. Now, we do a bunch of sensitivity checks, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. The only point that I would emphasize here is that we find an interesting correlation that service employment was stronger for those who acquired some education during this period. So it does seem to suggest that this is the link of investing more in human capital, and that will then lead to occupational shifts. Now, to improve on identification of the causal effects of displacement, we then focus on comparing siblings who followed different displacement trajectories during the war. Doing so accounts for both kind of locality, regional features where the households reside, and family features such as size, motivation to educate their children, connections that they may have in the cities or in neighboring countries, which can all jointly affect both displacement trajectories and human capital investments. Importantly, we focus on families that were together prior to the war. The siblings followed different trajectories. They were all then reunited in 1997, and therefore they're captured as such in the census as living together. Applying this template, we have a sample of about 136,000 individuals that come over a little bit over 45,000 households. This is just a distribution of the households across space. Importantly, we start by checking how different were these split households from other households in the country at the time. And what we find is that split households are similar to households without split siblings, but who were all displaced during this period. But they were also similar to households without split siblings that were not displaced. And they're similar in a very important dimension, which is the education of the grandparents. And this is a characteristic that is likely to have preceded the war. So it's the stock of human capital of the family. They differ in other ways. So they differ in that they're slightly larger and that they experience higher mortality, which is again consistent with this idea of conflict-driven displacement. So we begin by identifying pairs of siblings that are closest in age when one experienced displacement and the other one was a non-mover. We include, again, the three main trajectories: individual level controls, district of birth fixed effects for both siblings, age fixed effects, and the age difference fixed effects as well. And here the results are very similar to what we saw in the correlational analysis for those moving from a rural to urban setting. This is where we find a significant and sizable increase in the probability of schooling, in years of schooling, and this shift towards employment in services. The rural to rural movement also increases schooling, but appears to have no noticeable impact on employment. Urban to urban displacement, again, under the villagization schemes, also leads to lower schooling. And conversely, urban to urban movement leads to an increased accumulation of human capital. We find very limited heterogeneity when it comes to things like whether the individual moved with someone from the family, a parent or a grandparent. We don't find differences in refugees who moved across different borders and were in different host countries. And we find no significant differences depending on whether the individual at the end of the war returned to their place of birth or not. We then turn to the place-based effects versus uprootedness hypothesis as primary mechanisms who could be driving these investments in education. So starting with our within household specification, we try to parse out the component that is driven by being displaced when controlling for differences between the places of origin and the places of destination, both in terms of development characteristics and conflict. Differences in development are based on several development proxies that I mentioned earlier, and differences in conflict are based on both conflict events and landmine contamination. Finally, to account for endogeneity and the choice of location of displacement, we try to again extract the geographic distance component by instrumenting actual differences in development between origin and destination locality and in conflict with respect to districts that are within 100 kilometers from one's birthplace. So that's the instrument that we use to try to allay concerns about endogeneity and selection in the locality of displacement. And so what we find is that when we use this instrument, that both mechanisms are at place. We do find that the place-based effects are of a slightly larger magnitude, but we also find evidence that even when you move to an area that is comparable in terms of development, that you still invest more in education, which speaks to this uprootedness hypothesis and this desire to invest in a portable asset. Finally, we zoom into our main result, that those who moved into cities experienced higher accumulation of human capital. We try to understand whether these effects are long-lasting, whether there is convergence with education levels of their urban counterparts, and whether there are any additional long-term effects associated with displacement in the form of civic trust, social capital, or mental health. So we conducted a survey in the second largest city outside of the capital region, so Nampula. It's a city that doubled in size during the war, and we surveyed about 264 residents who were older than 35, so that they had experienced the war period. And we come up with a sample of about 102 IDPs and 162 Nampula-born individuals who never moved during the war. And these were all randomly selected across the different boroughs in the city. And there are three core results in our survey. First, when we compare those displaced to their siblings who remained in rural areas, we find that they invested more in education. So those who moved to the city invested more relative to the siblings who stayed behind. When we compare those displaced to the host urban community, we find evidence of educational convergence. Even though at the time there were very large gaps between rural and urban schooling attainment, we see that those who moved to Nampula actually caught up with their urban counterparts. But then we also find that IDPs, even 30 years after the end of the war that caused their displacement, tend to show lower levels of intercommunity trust, lower levels of civicness, and importantly, worse levels of mental health as well. So to conclude, we find that the type of displacement trajectory matters for human capital accumulation. We find also that moving to cities in particular is associated with an increased investment in education and important employment shifts that could be associated in an aggregate level in a post-conflict scenario with structural transformation. We find that both placed effect and uprootedness mechanisms are at play, again, with a slight dominance of the place-based effects in our particular setting. From a policy point of view, our findings seem to suggest that we should think about forced displacement also as an opportunity and a mobility shock. So managing displacement during conflict can shape human capital investments and structural transformation at an aggregate level, again, post-conflict. We should perhaps explore more integration policies that focus on urban integration, and at the same time to try to tackle the downside of displacement, namely its long-term effects on mental health and social cohesion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for a truly insightful and comprehensive presentation there. Some fascinating data sets that you have been able to analyze there and present to us. Again, inviting colleagues who are online to either raise your hand to provide a verbal intervention or question, but also to enter yours into the chat. We have one, and I'm going to try to read it to you. The non-movers presumably also faced negative impacts from conflict. In fact, they might have not been able to migrate to protect themselves from conflict due to their initial vulnerable conditions and might have been more affected by the impacts of conflict. In the case of Colombia, which has 8 million IDPs, those that were displaced were a bit better than the average rural household. Even though the paper controls for household characteristics, those that stay put were also facing the impacts of war. Is it possible to separate the effects of displacement from the negative effect on those that stayed put? Over to you.
Right. That's a great question. Thank you so much. I think that's precisely why we tried to get at the mechanism story. So looking at the place-based effects versus uprootedness. So what the place-based effect does is it compares at origin and at destination, for instance, differences in conflict levels. So that we control for the fact that you are moving to an area where you're less exposed, the sibling who moves is less exposed to conflict relative to the sibling who stays behind. So when we do that exercise, we do find that even just the displacement coefficient is still positive and significant, suggesting that even when you account for the fact that the person who moves is less exposed to conflict, we still find a significant and positive effect of displacement on investments in human capital. So I think that's precisely why we try to dig deeper into the mechanisms. There's a second question that relates more to identification, which is here the SUTFA, potential SUTFA violation. So if by having one sibling move either to a neighboring country or to a city, that the sibling who stays behind is actually worse off because of that, either because the sibling who moves with one of the parents or for any other reason. But what we do is, because we have the universe of the population, we can find these effects even when we restrict it to families where no one stayed behind. So we compare just people who went to refugee camps and someone who another sibling went to a rural location and another one went to a city. And so we find still these differences across the different trajectories as well. We also do several tests of, does it matter if the person who leaves with one of the parents or one of the grandparents, and does that affect the person who stays behind? And again, the results are very stable to that, but that was a very good question. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Again, I'm monitoring the chat for additional questions, seeing if any hands are raised. I don't see any at this point. Maybe I could pose a question to you regarding the analysis of integration, of local integration, as well as migration or displacement choices later in life. And I know you touch on that both in terms of educational choices, investments, but also the accumulation of human capital. But to what extent does that also lead to the attainment of local integration and durable solutions, as well as to what degree might those be able to be analyzed in terms of influencing future choices, whether it be migration or further displacement? Perhaps a stab at that question while we're waiting if there's other questions.
Right. Let me just double check that I understood. So the fact that some siblings move to the city, that would be a pull factor for other siblings as well. Is that what you're trying to get at? Or
I guess it's a bit of an open-ended question,
yeah.
Which is, I mean, not only does the accumulation of human capital then also equate toward local integration per se, and also linked to that, are there any findings related to migration choices later, or correlations with that, and the data sets that you examined?
Right. No, now I understand. Thanks so much. Yes, so unfortunately, we can't examine migration decisions later on. So it's just by the sheer nature of our design, our survey design, is that we're surveying people who are currently living in Nampula. And so we don't have anyone in our sample who later decided to migrate. I suppose that's a very important question, and we can fully disentangle the fact that people are more educated, if that facilitates economic and social integration as well. I suppose what we find is a kind of partial economic integration that is associated with, again, these are just correlations, but they're associated with investments in education. So we see convergence, that they tend to invest in schooling at the same rate as locals, as their urban counterparts. We do find that their wages tend to be slightly lower, even though we're controlling for the same level of education. So that again could speak to this partial integration, economic integration. So they get the education, they get jobs, they're equally likely to be employed, but the wages are lower for those who were displaced during this period. And then we have all the results, the social results and the mental health results, which again could be associated with or could be driving the negative wage results. So I do think that there are significant interactions between all of these, that education is likely to go a long way in facilitating at least partial socioeconomic integration into these settings. But it's not something that we can disentangle with the data that we have in our particular setting. But it's definitely something to think about for future research.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I think we're out of time, so we'll bring that to a close. Maybe just in conclusion, I want to thank all the presenters, Sandra, yourself, Yang, Alexandra, also Laura. Thank you, all of you, for your insightful presentations, and also all those who have participated with the discussions in the chat. So with that, we'll bring this session to a close.